Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We'll be starting soon. Thank you for joining us this morning. We'll be starting shortly. Just going to give a couple more minutes to let some more people join us. We'll be starting shortly. Unfortunately, for some reason, we cannot see the comments this morning, but if you leave them, we will try to answer them afterwards. We thank you for joining us. If you'd like to give a shout out, let us know where you're from.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Joe Schersch. I'm the house manager for the Phelps Mansion Museum. We are live at Spring Forest Cemetery on a beautiful Saturday morning. We couldn't ask for better weather today. We're going to be talking about symbolism in the cemetery on monuments throughout. We've kind of mapped out a few of the more common ones that can be found here in Spring Forest Cemetery. So we're expecting the tour to last about 45 minutes to an hour. So we hope that you can stay with us as we work our way through the cemetery this morning. So Mark is behind the camera helping me out here this morning. So we appreciate you spending some time with us and giving us a little bit of your Saturday morning. So a couple things. First of all, this is part of New York State's Path Through History weekend. Several historic sites throughout New York are participating in all types of different events throughout the weekend all across the state. So be sure to check out the New York State Path Through History's website so that you can find out what else is happening here locally.
It is all virtual this weekend too.
Almost all of them are virtual programming, I believe. So you can tune in from wherever you are and watch a lot of things and learn a lot about the state's history. So as we move through the cemetery today, we just thought we'd take a quick second to talk about cemetery etiquette. The most important thing when walking through and exploring a cemetery is to always be respectful of the people who are buried here and the families who have monuments here in the cemetery. As you'll see today, I'm going to try my best not to walk directly over the grave sites wherever possible. It's best to avoid that, rather move between the monuments or behind them, or stay on the paths throughout the cemetery. Always follow the cemetery rules. Note that many cemeteries close after dark, so it's best to explore the cemeteries in the daytime because there's a lot of uneven surfaces and fallen stones, so it can be pretty hazardous if you're not able to see where you're going.
But you can always ask for permission.
But you can always ask for permission, absolutely. One of the other things as a historian, you know, in a historic house museum, we always tell people don't touch the woodwork, you know, because over the years, if you touch things too much, they eventually start to wear away. The same is true with headstones and monuments throughout the cemetery. So do your best to observe them, but minimize or no touching if possible. Because also some of these are very fragile, and it wouldn't take much at this point to break something loose off of here or any of these monuments throughout the cemetery. And the other thing is be careful around the monuments too, because again, some of them are quite old. Some of them have been here probably as long as 1850, and they can, without warning, sometimes fall, or things could break off. So you kind of want to be aware of the condition of the monument that you're checking out while you're observing it.
And the ground you're walking on.
And the ground you're walking on. And lastly, and probably the most important thing is keep your distance from any family who may be visiting a loved one's gravesite. You always want to give them their space. So, you know, if you see somebody here who's tending to a gravesite or maybe just lost a loved one, you know, maybe explore a different part of the cemetery and let them have their privacy. So with that being said, we'll get into the tour itself. Again, this cemetery was founded in the early 1850s, 1852, I think, as Spring Forest Cemetery here in Binghamton. There are over 60 acres here in the cemetery with beautiful trees and paths, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that as we move through the tour. You know, during the 19th century, there were a lot of secret languages, like the language of the fan. You know, the way a lady held a fan or moved a fan could signify different things. They also had a secret language when it came to dealing with calling cards. You know, the way a calling card had a corner bent could signify a certain meaning. And so the same thing holds true with a lot of the symbols that you'll see here in the cemetery as well, as we move through the tour. So, early gravestones or grave monuments tend to deal with memento mori. And memento mori is Latin. It means remember that you will die, basically. It dates back to the ancient Roman times. And oftentimes memento mori monuments depict skulls with wings, coffins. They have very stark, deep epitaphs. So they're kind of very dark, and you know, there was a certain attitude in the 1700s about death. And those attitudes slowly change over time as you get into the 19th century. And with that change, the epitaphs and the symbolism on gravestones and headstones also changes as well. So that's what we're going to be looking at today, are the meanings behind some of the symbols. And again, this is not an all-inclusive list. This cemetery doesn't have examples of every single one, but it has an example of quite a few of the different symbols that we'll see throughout. These headstones commemorate or celebrate the dead to benefit those they have left behind. That was an attitude change that happens in the 19th century. So celebrating the death of a loved one and remembering them, and so oftentimes these symbols will help us to convey these messages of remembrance. So what do these symbols mean? As you can see here, Mark's going to pan up to this one here. You can see this lady depicted here on this obelisk, which we'll talk more about obelisk in a little bit. But you can see she's pointing up. Hopefully you guys can see that okay. I know it's quite bright right here, but we're going to move to a shadier part in a minute. She's also holding an anchor in her hand, and she appears to be kind of floating on almost like a cloud of flowers. There's calla lilies, there's roses, there's morning glories, and all of these things symbolize different meanings. And so that's really what we're going to be looking at as we move through the cemetery today. One of the other most common things that we'll see are the depiction of an hourglass. An hourglass basically is a reminder that our time here is minimal on earth, and that for every hour passed we are 1 hour closer to death. If the hourglass is depicted on its side, it usually means that a person's life was cut short. And of course, one of the other famous or more well-known images is the Grim Reaper with his scythe or sickle. The scythe is a symbol of death, as is the Grim Reaper, and the sickle or the scythe is basically something that was used to cut down the harvest or reap. So that is a depiction on a lot of the older tombstones throughout this cemetery. You'll often see the Grim Reaper holding the scythe or the sickle in his hand. So with that being said, I think we'll move to our first stop. If we're good to go, Mark, you good to go?
Yeah.
Okay. So we are going to be walking a lot, so there'll be a few moments of pause, but we've got them pretty spaced out here so they're not too far apart. So come on and join me.
And I'll try not to make you seasick.
So throughout the cemetery, there are a lot of monuments and headstones depicting all different types of crosses. And the crosses were a religious message and symbolizing the crucifix. And usually they're based on Christianity. We'll see different types of crosses, and I'll try to remember to point them out as we move throughout the cemetery. After the cross, one of the other most appearing symbols that you'll see throughout the cemetery is the urn. The urns are designed to represent a funeral urn and thought to symbolize immortality. Cremation was a very early form of preparing the dead for burial. In some periods it was actually more common than burial. The shape of the container in which the ashes were placed could take the form of a simple box or a marble vase. But no matter what it looked like, it was called an urn. And an urn, that word is derived from the Latin uro, meaning to burn. As burials became more common, the urn continued to be closely associated with death. On this particular example too, you'll see the cloth over the urn, or the draping cloth, and that's symbolizing that it's guarding the ashes. The shroud draped urn is believed by some to mean that the soul has departed the shrouded body for its trip to heaven. Others say that the drape signifies the last partition between life and death. So that is an example of an urn with a shroud or a drape over it. And in some instances you'll just see the urns alone. But there are a lot of these urns throughout the cemetery with the drape over the tops of them. So, any questions or anything so far?
Nope.
Okay. All right, we'll continue on here. I think our next stop here will be the obelisk. So it's believed that the obelisk represents a single ray of sunlight that was petrified from sunlight to stone. And in some instances, it's also believed that the Egyptian sun god Ra lives within the obelisk. The most famous obelisk and the tallest in the world, of course, is the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C., which was built to honor George Washington. Directly in front of this obelisk here, we have a couple examples of monuments here with scrolls. And you'll see scrolls a lot throughout the cemetery in varying forms and consistency. You'll also see some that have open books, and we'll talk about the open book when we get to an example of that. But for the scrolls, they can have all sorts of different meanings. But books and scrolls also represent the evangelist. Open books can represent a love of learning, an openness of new ideas. Also, the book could be open to like a biblical passage. So sometimes you'll see just a book that's plain on top, and then sometimes you'll see a book that's open and has a passage from the Bible engraved into the bookwork as well. So, okay. All right. I have to remember where our next stop is. We've walked it a couple times, but still tend to forget sometimes. Here in the cemetery, you can see some other examples of, like, this is a scroll that's kind of holding a tablet here, and then over here we have some more. These are very old tombstones here. They're from the 1856, 1857, but you can see the decorative work in there. Can you see that okay, Mark? Yeah. So there's a lot of different things. In this case, the scrolls have the name of the person and their birthday and death date on them. So this is a great example here in the cemetery of the scrolls. And as you can see, the tombstones are placed relatively close together. This is all, in this instance, this lot here is all one particular family's plot. So you can see there's quite a few monuments of varying sizes and shapes here in this particular plot. So, all right. And as we move through the cemetery too, you'll see different obelisks of different size, different shapes anyways. So you can see there's an example of a smaller one back there. We'll show you a couple of the other ones as we move through the cemetery. We'll stop here for a moment and take a look at this one. Mark's going to pan up to the top of this one here. It's quite tall. And you can see this figure here. She's holding an anchor and her finger is pointing upwards, indicating that the person who's buried here has gone to heaven. The anchor is often found on the graves of sailors, but it can be found on other monuments as well. And generally speaking, the anchor symbolizes steadfast hope or eternal life. Anchors were also used as Masonic symbols representing well-grounded hope. So occasionally you'll find an anchor on a grave of a Mason as well. So hopefully you guys can see that okay.
A little hard with the backlighting, but get my best shot, man.
And then here, right next to the other one we were just looking at, we have an angel. And if you look really closely in her hand, she's also holding an anchor. And what looks to maybe be an oak leaf. Oak leaves were symbols of strength, honor, steadfast, and immortality. And we just talked about the anchor. But as you, this particular one is very interesting because as you move around the monument here, you'll see there are different angels depicted. So in this case, we have an angel who looks to be praying. So you can see her hands there. And then if you come around the back side, there is this angel here who, it's hard to say because it's pretty worn, but it looks like she may have been holding an hourglass. And possibly, what did we think this might be? I don't remember now. Like a broken chain, or
yeah, broken.
Like a broken link, which symbolizes.
Or, actually, I think it was an anchor too. If you remember the.
Oh yeah, or it could have been an anchor as well there too. But again, it's pretty hard to tell because it's quite worn. And then on the front side, there's a piece on the ground that goes on the other side of the stone. Unfortunately, it's quite damaged and pretty hard to make out. But you can see, I think there's some maybe flowers here. And again, I can't really tell what she's holding in this instance because
it's hard to tell.
That would have gone there. So we also have some examples here as we move down of different crosses. So as we continue to walk, we'll take a look at some of these crosses. We also have these very Gothic-like monuments throughout the cemetery. Another obelisk. If you look at this obelisk too, this one has an urn at the top with a flame. And the flame represents undying friendship and the representation of the eternal flame. You'll also see on this monument, around the name, there's a wreath, and we'll discuss the wreaths in just a little bit, but since it's here, I just wanted to point it out to you guys as well. And then as we continue down again, Mark will show you different examples of these crosses. There's lots of different variations on the cross throughout the cemetery. Lots of Celtic crosses too, and a different part of the cemetery as well. Does anybody have any questions or anything before we go?
I don't see any right at the moment, but
Okay.
I'm afraid to touch it without shutting it off. Excuse me.
So here again, we have another example of an obelisk with a wreath. Mark's going to just set the camera down for a minute because we want to talk about this next stone over here. But before we do, I just want to give Mark time to do what he needs to do. Oh, good?
Yep.
All right. So one of the other common things that you'll see throughout the cemetery are the use of the lamb. Lambs are often found on children's monuments. So here in this case, we have a very small monument here in the cemetery with a little lamb on top. And if you notice down below, and I will tell you guys that we put that there, it's not always here. But we wanted to talk just a minute about mourning dolls. So you can see this is an example of a mourning doll here. Because of the close proximity to death at home and high mortality rates among children and infants, kids were exposed to death a lot more than they may be today. By the late 19th century, it became custom to have mourning dolls or grave dolls made. And these basically serve two purposes. First, it was to teach a young child about death. For example, maybe a sibling passed away. The family might dress the doll up in mourning. So as the family mourned, the doll also mourned. And you have to remember in the 19th century, there were very strict mourning rituals and customs and whatnot. So this was one way of addressing that. Sometimes they would place the dolls at the gravesite so that the child would have something to play with on the other side. And sometimes too, we saw a few examples in the research that they may even have a funeral for the doll as well. The other function of a mourning doll was to help a family grieve the loss of a child. So when a child died, it was traditional for families who could afford it to have a life-sized wax effigy of the child made for the funeral. Typically, the doll was dressed in the deceased infant or child's own clothing, and sometimes they would even use the child's own hair to make the doll look as realistic as possible. These wax dolls were usually shown lying in a coffin-like setting, and their eyes were typically closed. The back sides of the head were flat so that the doll could lay nicely when laid out to rest. And the effigy doll would be put on display at the wake and would then be left at the gravesite. But sometimes the dolls weren't actually buried. In some cases, the family would keep the dolls and place them in a crib. Sometimes they would actually go as far as changing the clothes of the doll and treating it like a real baby. The bodies of the dolls were clothed and weighted with sand to give it a realistic feel when it was being held. And other times the dolls would be framed as a memorial or tribute to a lost child. For older children, just the head and shoulders were created in wax effigy, also with the flat back sides. So again, the doll could be displayed in a frame or almost like a shadow box display to be put on display in a family's home to again remember a lost child or loved one. But these were specifically dealing with children. So, okay. So you probably won't find many of these lying around today in cemeteries, but they are still able to be purchased quite frequently online. You'll find varying examples of mourning dolls. So this one is part of Mark's personal collection. So, all right. Anything else so far? Good.
Yep. So
All right. If anybody has any questions about anything else in the cemetery or anything else in general, please let us know and chime in. Also, let us know where you're watching from, so we can see how far this is going, just for our own curiosity's sake. But otherwise, we'll continue on down the line.
All right.
So, I'll grab this for you, Mike.
Okay, moving on.
As we walk past here, there's another obelisk with another wreath. Kind of a little bit of ways to our next stop, so I'll just kind of talk as we're walking. But Spring Forest Cemetery represents a movement that occurred around the 1830s and 1840s and continuing on, where cemeteries were no longer built next to churches or like in our case in Binghamton, there was a graveyard on the courthouse grounds for a long time. But eventually cemeteries became bigger and were created to be almost like park-like settings. So you have these beautiful cemeteries here with paths and lots of trees and sometimes ponds or lakes. In fact, Spring Forest Cemetery at one point had a creek that ran through it, but it doesn't run through here no longer. It's underground, basically buried. And so this is a great example of that movement and time. And it's particularly interesting to note that a cemetery like this would have really considered to be the outskirts of town, but today as populations continue to expand, oftentimes these cemeteries are enclosed in surrounding neighborhoods like we have here at this cemetery today. There are businesses on this side and homes on all the other sides, and then a highway on the other side of the road here. So you know, this is a great example of that. So if you ever get a chance to walk through here and just take it all in, you know, you certainly can. And back then, cemeteries were almost like tourist destinations. People would come to them, you know, to see them. They would have picnics with their families in the cemetery. So much like we would go to a county park or something today, back then, before county parks existed, your local cemetery was really the park. So, okay. All right, keep going around the corner here. Oh, do you want to talk about that stone?
Oh, sure.
Over here?
Yeah,
Or
sure.
do you want to
why
wait till
not?
we get to the other side?
It doesn't matter.
Okay. One of the other things that we're going to see throughout the cemetery are these massive stone-like monuments. And we weren't originally going to talk about these, but there's so many of them here that it kind of caught our attention and made us wonder what exactly is the story behind them. And of course, if I could, I had to write this in. So
Want me to get it?
What's that?
You want me to get it?
No, I got it. I just have to find out where I wrote it, because I added it after we typed these notes up. Oh, here it is. Here it is. So, basically, the rough stone monuments that you see throughout the cemetery are an idea that while we have accomplished many things during our life, we have even more to learn in the afterlife. In other words, don't put too much importance on what you do or don't achieve during your lifetime, because we still have more refining or polishing to do in our afterlife. So these rough stones, you know, right around the names have this little bit of polishing and refining to them, but the rest of the stone is untouched, and that's signifying that we still have a lot to learn and a lot more refining to do. So you'll see a lot of those throughout the cemetery.
Excuse me. Let's pause just for a second so I can put this away here. Gonna pause for a second.
We really lucked out today. It's a beautiful, beautiful day, and the wind's not too bad. So hopefully you guys are all hearing me okay. But if you're not, please let us know, and I will speak louder. We're going to make our stop over here to this very interesting monument. Just a moment. On a lot of older cemeteries, you'll find monuments like this with broken tree trunk. Occasionally you'll even just find like carved stones that look like stumps on the ground, and as you might imagine, basically these are symbolizing a life cut short. And so you'll see varying examples of these types of stones throughout the cemetery as well. I think there's another example of just the stump a little further up here, so we'll take a look at that one and show you the different variations on it. What was that? crosses there as well. And as we come around,
Another one of the
tree
stones
here,
there too.
you'll notice the largest obelisk in Spring Forest Cemetery is this one here on the hill that belonged to a gentleman named Orlo Chapman. So, some more examples of the rough stone with a cross. And here is another example of a different one. This one just being a stump, so you can see here. This particular example there is a pretty good one to show.
This one has fallen over, obviously, but
yeah, it would have been standing up a little bit more straight. It's kind of toppled over a little bit as the ground is settling underneath it. So, now, where was that one with the links? So here, on this particular stone, you see the 3 links. Now if you see broken links on a headstone, that usually means the subsequent release of the spirit from the body. But in this case, these chains are insignia for the International Order of Oddfellows. And this particular fraternal organization was dedicated to giving the poor decent burials. Up louder. So you can see here the International Order of Oddfellows. The chains represent friendship, love, and truth. And sometimes you'll even see the letters FLT incorporated into the stonework itself as well. So that's a good example of one of those. And you'll see that a lot again as well. There's a lot of Masonic symbolism throughout the cemetery too. So, okay, louder. Okay, sorry guys, I'll talk louder, I promise. All right, let's keep going. Here's where you really start to see a lot of those rough stones. There's a really large one here. And then directly behind it, there's another one. I'm not sure if Mark can zoom in, but there's another one up there by the tree with the urn on top. Wow. And then again, lots and lots of obelisks. And there's a great example of a monument in the back here with the urn on top, and then has the drapery over the stone. So again, remember we talked about the drapery there earlier, so you can see that one back there as well. You see that one I'm talking about, Mark? Yeah. And as we continue on down, you see Spring Forest Cemetery is home to many mausoleums, including the Phelps mausoleums here. Basically anybody who had anything to do with the Phelps mansion is buried here in Spring Forest Cemetery as well.
And early Binghamton.
And early Binghamton, yes. If you walk around the cemetery, you'll see a lot of names on a lot of these stones that are, a lot of our streets are named after. Okay, so here we have another symbol that appears frequently throughout. This is the crown. Sometimes you just see the crown, other times you see the crown with the cross. We also have an urn here on top of this particular monument as well. The crowns represent the glory of life after death and the deceased ascension into heaven. Sometimes it also signifies immortality victory, and righteousness. So you'll see those again in many, many places throughout the cemetery. In fact, not too far from here, there's another great example of that, just a little ways up there. So. And then for this one, the broken column, much like the tree stump, signifies a life cut short. And typically a broken column is a memorial to someone who died very young or in the prime of their life. And in this particular case, this one is a stone that belongs to a young lady who was 35 years old when she passed away. So again, you'll see a broken column, and many old cemeteries have a broken column. So. In fact, I think Floral Park is another great example, which is also owned and maintained by the people here at Spring Forest Cemetery. They have a lot of great examples too. And if you're interested in knowing more specific about the history of this cemetery and more of the residents who are buried here, I would strongly encourage you to tune into Jerry Smith's Spring Forest Cemetery virtual tour, which is scheduled for the end of the month. I want to say the 24th, but if you Google it, it'll come up with a link, and I'm not sure if it's free or if there's a fee, but I know that Jerry does a very thorough detail of the residents and more specifically the history behind the cemetery. So
let's take a minute to answer some questions.
Okay.
You want to come over, scroll this? There is one question. I'm pretty sure there's a section for the firemen, also a section for the women who died in the factory fire. You are correct?
That is correct, yes. Let's see, I'm
So
just
we're
trying
just
to
going
see.
to review and answer some questions because the scrolling is going by quick and it only shows us one line at a time.
Yeah, and if we miss your question, I promise that when I get back to the museum this afternoon, I will get back to you. So please don't think we're ignoring you. But yes, there is a fireman section and there is a clothing factory monument here that was a memorial to the women who died in the clothing factory fire. So we won't see those today on our tour, but they are here in the cemetery. Unfortunately, they're not on the route that we're taking today. So, but yes, I see some people are telling you exactly how to get there. So, and they are correct on how to get there. So they know. All right. So I think that's good. We'll keep going here.
All right. Here's a beautiful example of the Celtic cross.
Yeah, that's one of my favorite ones. A lot of the older families right here in this particular section of the cemetery, like Joshua Whitney and even the Weed family goes back a long time. The Ely family, which, again, there's streets named after here in Binghamton. So I promise we talk about the wreaths. So let's head up here and talk about the wreaths for a minute. So a lot of times you'll see these wreaths, and we'll show you some more as we go around the corner. But basically the wreaths are symbolizing victory over death. And sometimes they're just alone like this, other times they're incorporated with other different symbols on the stones, but these are really good examples here of the two that we have right here in front of us, so you can see them there as well. And then again, a lot of other great stones here. This particular Whitney one is pretty interesting as well. Again, the rough stone, and I'm not sure what kind of flowers those are on that particular one, but I'd have to look more into it to figure that out. But, or if anybody knows, can you zoom in on that one? Let us know what you think those are.
Could be a couple things. Could be like the oak leaf with. Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, let's hear what you think. And this is another great example of the drapery. This is one of my favorite ones here. I love this one. Okay.
All right, we're on the final leg of our tour here, so we'll keep going.
You got one more over here.
Oh, Ellen. We missed Ellen. The other crown.
Oh, and the other one. The one over.
Oh, yeah. Do you want to show them the crown one real quick? Mark's going to take you over just to show you another example of one of the crowns on this particular monument here.
Oh, someone said maybe a poppy.
A poppy?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that would
make sense.
Mm-hmm. You can see there's a lot of great examples of a lot of older stones here in this particular section. So, we mentioned earlier the scythe and the sickle and the hourglass. And here's a great example of all of that happening in one stone. The broken column, what do you think that was? Like
the olive branch?
The olive branch. The hourglass down in the corner, and then you can't really make it out too much, but he's holding, oh, it's right here. The scythe is here. So there's a lot of symbolism in this particular stone.
And the book,
which is from 1882. Yeah, she has the book. There's a book there. And
so obviously it represents that she was cut down in life and rather young, because she died at 23 years old.
Right.
So there's a whole lot of representation just in this one single image.
Yeah, so that's a good one. That's a really good one.
Yep.
And I'll show you some more. There's another really great example at the end of the tour as well. So
there's another great urn with the cloth over it. I think I saw somebody asking what would be the oldest grave in this cemetery. This cemetery, I believe, was built in
1851, 52, I think?
Something
if I
like
remember
that.
correctly.
But they did move some bodies from downtown Binghamton. So as for what the oldest one is, we're not sure, because the original graveyard was moved from the courthouse to, what was the other one? Eldridge
Street.
Eldridge Street, and then some moved to here, some moved to Glenwood Cemetery.
Here's some more examples of the wreaths on this particular family plot here as well, so we'll point those out as we walk by them. It seems like the obelisk was one of the most common ones throughout the cemetery.
Yes, you should see the video after the live program,
Yep.
probably within a half hour or something
Yeah, so
after
if
it's
you can't
posted.
stick around with us, you can always watch it again later, for sure. So here's an example of a book on a particular stone. This one's kind of hard to read because it's pretty faded or worn down, but that's a good example. A lot of times I've seen them too, like on a flatter top, and the book is just opened on top of the monument. So. That's the flash pan. So here's another relatively older stone. And you can see here the clasped hands, which are another very popular symbol. The cuffs, if they match, which in this particular instance is a little difficult to make out, is a handshake of farewell to the earthly existence. If the cuffs are male and female, it indicates hands clasped in death as in life.
Which this one kind of looks like. It looks like she got ruffles there, and he's got the straight.
So this could be an example of a male and a female hands clasped together. Anyways, also signifies eternal devotion, and occasionally clasped hands can be signifying being guided to heaven, like someone is reaching out and
taking God's hand.
Taking God's hand. So, yeah. So this is a really good one, and in fact, I don't really know if there's other great examples, but this one's a good one. So.
Someone asked if there were some metal headstones. Yes, we will be getting to those shortly.
We're going to talk about those.
Yep. Another urn. Another example of the stone, the cross.
Yeah, there's a lot of Civil War vets here in Spring Forest Cemetery. Quite a few well-knowns. This is a really neat example. Here you can see, in this particular case, the drape this time is the flag with the stars and the stripes. You have the Civil War cap here, the sword, and the scabbard. I always forget that part. And
tassel. The
tassel here representing that this young man was a major in the Civil War. He died at Fort Gregg, Virginia.
At the taking of Fort
Gregg. He was 21 years old. It's pretty remarkable to be a major at the age of 21 years old. So this is a really, really neat example. Also, again, you can see another form of a wreath here, kind of underneath the flag. So.
But this is a beautifully sculpted tombstone.
Mm-hmm.
You got to remember, a lot of these were all hand sculpted. Lost art today. Lost art. Yeah. Is there a metal Celtic cross? We're not sure, but there are
a lot of Celtic crosses, but I haven't seen any metal ones.
Yeah, but there are some metal headstones, which we'll be talking about shortly.
All right, so before we talk about our next topic, for those of you who may have never visited the Phelps Mansion before, or if those of you who have, you know that the story behind the Phelps family is pretty tragic. Mr. Phelps's first wife, who they were wed in 1842, died almost just about a year after they were married, and tragically 4 days after they had both lost their 4-month-old baby daughter Stella. In 1863, Sherman's second wife passed away very young. She was only about, I think, 35 years old at the time of her passing. And then in 1878, of course, Mr. Phelps passed away at the age of 64. 2 years after his death, Mr. Phelps's youngest son, Arthur, died at the age of 21 from spinal meningitis. The very next year, Mr. Phelps's oldest son died at the age of 26 from apoplexy, which is like a stroke or a cerebral hemorrhage. And then 10 months after Robert's death, the oldest son, Robert's wife, Harriet, whose portrait hangs in our parlor, passed away at the age of 26 years old. And when she passed away, it says she died from, it says rheumatism attacked her heart in the obituary and newspapers that were publishing these death notices. So within 4 years after Sherman Phelps's death, the entire family that was living in the Phelps Mansion was gone. So Mr. Phelps had a plot here in Spring Forest Cemetery. A few years later, for reasons that we don't really know, Robert Phelps had a mausoleum built on the family plot. And basically, you know, during this time, especially if you go to some of the older cemeteries, you'll see a lot of times examples of people protecting grave sites because of fears of grave robbery. One of those things that comes about because of grave robbings, of course, are the mausoleums, because they are believed to be stronger and more secure. However, that wasn't always necessarily true, and there are many great examples of mausoleums being broken into and bodies being removed from their final resting places, including a New York City millionaire named A.T. Stewart, who was reportedly worth $50 million when he died. He had been buried in an enormous underground chamber, but that didn't stop the thieves. They took his body and his casket's silver hardware and demanded $250,000 ransom. In March of 1879, the family agreed to pay $20,000 to get the body back. And here in Spring Forest Cemetery, we have an example of a mausoleum that was broken into. And it would be the Phelps family mausoleum. So I'm going to make my way up to the Phelps family mausoleum and tell you the story of the Phelps family break-in. So here behind me, you can see the Phelps Mausoleum that was built by Robert Phelps. And at the time it was built, the first Mrs. Phelps and the baby daughter Stella were disinterred from their final resting place in Pennsylvania and brought here and placed in this mausoleum. And then of course Mr. Phelps in 1878, Arthur, Mrs. Phelps, the second Mrs. Phelps, Harriet, they're all inside this mausoleum. But on the nights of October 22nd and 23rd of 1884, the mausoleum here in Spring Forest Cemetery was broken into by William Taylor, a gentleman named Dan Richards, and another gentleman. And basically, they were looking for evidence to find out why the estate had received a bill for $5,000 for the embalming of Robert's body. Now, there was a lot of death that Robert had seen over the years, and he was pretty fearful of dying. And so he took a lot of precautionary measures to have his body preserved in his casket. But unfortunately, all that preparation, and still, he didn't really get the piece that he was looking for. So the Phelps Mausoleum was the victim of a break-in in October 1884. Like I said, this was a result of a messy court battle between the doctor that had embalmed Robert and Hattie's father, William E. Taylor. Eli, the doctor, had sued Taylor after Hattie's death, claiming that the doctor had never been paid $5,000 that was owed to him for the embalming of Robert's body. Now, the average price for embalming back then was about $500. And in the midst of this messy court battle, Hattie's father, William Taylor, Dan Richards, and Robert Richards were accused of breaking into the family vault, hoping to get enough evidence to prove that Robert had not been properly embalmed, therefore rendering the court battle unnecessary. Taylor had said the contract was void by reason of fraud and undue influence. He denied that the body was embalmed and alleged further that Dr. Eli had agreed to embalm the body so that it would be white as marble and last forever. So Dan Richards told the court on the nights of October 22nd and 23rd that they broke into the vault to gain evidence that the body was not as Dr. Eli said it would be. Upon revealing the body, all that was there were bones and clothing. Well, Binghamton was scandalized that such well-to-do men would commit such an act, and all three men were indicted. One Pennsylvanian wrote that Robert's grave had been brutally desecrated, and the crime was thought by all people to be the work of common low body snatchers, but instead it was done by some of the highest regarded citizens in Binghamton. Dr. Eli ultimately lost the court case. The defendants were placed on trial for burglary in the third degree. Robert Richards was discharged. William Taylor was acquitted, and Dan Richards was found guilty. And so that's the story in a nutshell, because there's a lot of court records that are very long that go over this in every small detail imaginable. But it's interesting to note that since the break-in, no one has been in or out of the vault, and no one knows where the key is for the vault. And on another side note, I would just like to say that a lot of the research that was done for this particular topic was done by our executive director's daughter, Tamara, who is a phenomenal researcher, and she basically scoured over these court records to learn the story behind this break-in. So the next time you're walking through here, you can remember the story of the Phelps mausoleum break-in. The door on this mausoleum is a granite door with a keyhole that's very, very deep, so the key for this mausoleum would be rather large. But again, it is missing in action, so it'll stay sealed for pretty much ever at this point. All right, let's see if I can get out of here safely, and we'll continue on.
While we wait for Joe to come around, we'll take a lovely view of the cemetery. Is the Dr. Eli of Eli Street and Park same family, I believe?
Yeah.
He's like the...
There's a lot of Eli's, but it's of the same family.
Yep.
Yeah. He's buried in Floral Park Cemetery. The doctor is.
We're going to make one last stop here before we wrap things up.
See me better rather than in the sunlight. So here we have an example of two cast zinc headstones here in the cemetery. And to be honest with you, I didn't really know much about them until we started looking into these, and they're actually pretty fascinating history. So cast zinc headstones were popular in the 1880s through the 1900s. They don't rust. And they were less expensive than marble or granite. Sometimes they were referred to as white bronze. And in some instances, actually, people didn't like them because they thought they were cheap looking. And at one point or another, a lot of cemeteries actually banned them from being placed within a cemetery. The zinc cast iron monuments were made originally by a gentleman named M.A. Richardson of Chautauqua, New York, and two of his partners. They tried to get a business started but failed, and so eventually in 1879 the rights were sold to a monumental bronze company in Bridgeport, Connecticut, and they had plants in Chicago, Des Moines, Iowa, Detroit, Philadelphia, New Orleans, and Canada. But after World War I, these tended to disappear and were stopped being produced because the company switched gears and started using the metals to help in the war efforts. But if you look at them, they're really great, and these ones have almost everything that we just talked about in one place. So here you have the flowers, the rose, and these plates were designed by the family. So it was basically, you could go in and order these different designs, and then they would be screwed on here to the monument. They're hollow inside. So we have, where are these? Is that the Calla Lily or no?
No, the Morning Glories or Forget-Me-Nots.
Yeah. And then we have over here on this side again the cross and crown. And then as you come around the corner, you have the angel praying. And then on this side, you have the anchor. And then down below, we have an hourglass here. And then on the front is the nameplate for this particular family's memorial. And it says that oftentimes where it was made, what city, can be found along the base of the monuments. But I'm not seeing anything on this particular one.
It's also said one of the weaknesses to these things is the bigger they got, the bottoms would collapse. And you can see this has got cracks in it, and it's kind of bowing. Well, I don't know if you can see the bowing or not, but it's bowing a little bit. And they said because of the weight and it's hollow, that these bottoms would actually eventually collapse underneath them. So they would either come back and put braces in the bottom of them, or, you know, things happen.
And then here we have another, this is a smaller example, but you have like the sheaves of wheat, the broken flowers symbolizing death. And then over here, again, the flowers, but you also have the 3 chains that we mentioned earlier. And then again, the cross and the crown here. So basically we could have gave the tour just walking around these 2 monuments, but that wouldn't have been any fun. But these are really, really neat examples, and you do see them from time to time in a lot of the older cemeteries. So I'm not sure where we are on time at this point, but probably wrap it up here for you guys.
11:05.
Thank you so much for joining us. I hope you get online and explore some more path through history this weekend. There are different sites, like I said, doing different things on today, tomorrow, and Monday. So check out that website so you could watch some more virtual programming right now until, you know, things calm down in the world. This is about the best way to stay safe. Is just stay home and do our part, and hopefully we'll all be able to get back together, and maybe someday we'll have a real live walking tour of Spring Forest Cemetery.
And if you enjoy what we do, we realize times are tight, but if you feel obligated, please visit phelpsmansion.org and donate wherever you can. It helps every little bit, because what's going on, our tours have been cut down, we can't do live programming, so funding is a little tight here, and you know, we got to feed Joe somehow. And also, next week, if you enjoy this subject, we are doing a live feed program on the music of mourning and remembrance with pianist Tej Ritz and myself, and I believe it should be a great fun program and very interesting as well. So thank you for joining us today.
That'll be on our Facebook page next Saturday at 6 o'clock, so you can join us virtually again and watch that concert performed from the ballroom of the Phelps Mansion. And lastly, if you haven't been to visit the Phelps Mansion, when you feel safe to do so, please consider coming to visit and take a tour. Tours are running Friday, Saturday, and Sunday from 11 to right now. Our last tour is at 5 o'clock. That's just for the month of October. And then we'll be going back to our 3:30 last tour. But tours are booked online. Your tour is your tour. We are not mixing tour groups, so we have 30 minutes in between each tour time to clean the building and get ready for our next group of visitors. So
if you'd like a private tour of the Phelps Mansion,
this is the way to do it.
Yep, visit our website, sign up. And I don't know, you want to answer any questions before we go?
Yeah, let's just check and see if there's any last questions before we turn it off and move along.
Any final questions for us?
And like I said, if we missed anything, we'll go back through and answer any questions that we can just as soon as I get back to the museum.
Oh, we are glad you guys enjoyed it. Thank you for joining us today.
And get out and explore the cemeteries. It's a good way to be outside while the weather's still nice. So All right, guys.
Margaret, you'll be able to watch the video afterwards in a few minutes. So don't fret. We sorry to hear you've been having problems, but like I said, you'll be able to check in later. Thank you, Jerry, and thank you everyone for joining us today.
All right, till next time, guys. See you later.
We'll see you next week. There we go.